Good evening and welcome to the fourth annual Monnet lecture. My name is Yannis Tivaktis. I'm professor of political science and Monnet chair at Virginia Tech. I'm also the director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, known as CEUTS, which has been recognized by the European Commission as a Monnet Center of Excellence, one of the 8 Monnet Centers of Excellence that exist currently in the United States. This year's lecture will be delivered by His Excellency Michael Curtis, Deputy EU Ambassador to the United States. Your Excellency, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you with us this evening. It's certainly very nice to see you again. Due to his heavy schedule, His Excellency will talk to us for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we are going to have a Q&A session for about 15 to 20 minutes. This evening's Q&A session will be moderated by Chad Hackinson, CEUTS Associate Director for Administration and Strategic Planning. It's also a great pleasure and honor to have with us this evening Professor Laura Belmonte, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, who will introduce our honorable guest. But before I give the floor to Dean Belmonte, I would like to say a few more words. Today's event marks the end of the 4th year of CEUTS. This has been a very active and successful year. However, nothing would have been done without the commitment and hard work of my CEUTS colleagues. Therefore, I would like to recognize in alphabetical order all those colleagues who have served CEUTS from different positions. Colin Baker, Esther Bauer, Erin Bradley, Natalia Bradley, Glenn Bew, Ralph Hall, Chad Hackinson, Farida Salansai, Sarah Johnson, Brian Klausmeyer, Tracy Crouchon, Scott Nelson, Joel Peters, Georgetta Pourceau, Chris Price, Besnik Pula, Sean Respes, Max Stevenson, Will Taggart, and Dimitris Sarouchas. I would like to thank Miabella Wary and Jacob Johnson for establishing and leading the European and Transatlantic Affairs Organization, a student organization which is also the VT chapter of the European Horizons Transatlantic Organization. And thank you all to all VT students who have joined it. Thank you to all senior and junior researchers, and especially to those contributing to our research programs and publications. Special thanks go to Dean Belmonte, Karen Roberto, Director of the Institute for Society, Culture and the Environment, and Tim Luke, Chair of the Department of Political Science and Acting Director of the School for Public and International Affairs, for their financial support and encouragement. I would also like to recognize the chairs of the Stakeholders Department, Tim Luke from Political Sciences PR, Jennifer Hart from History, and Janelle Watson from Modern and Classical Language and Literatures. I would like to express our appreciation to the European Commission, for without support, we couldn't be here today. Last but not least, we are grateful to you all for being here with us today and for attending the events we organized throughout the year. Thank you very much for all your support. Dean Belmonte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yannis. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Curtis. Michael Curtis has been the EU Deputy Ambassador to the United States since September 1st, 2019. Immediately before joining the delegation, he served in the team of the EU's Foreign Policy Chief, Federica Mogherini, advising her on a number of important foreign policy issues for 5 years, including on transatlantic relations. He has had a long career in the European Union institutions, working mainly on foreign policy and external relations, trade, development, and humanitarian issues. From 2004 to 2008, he worked as the EU Humanitarian Affairs Counselor to the United Nations in New York. From 2000 to 2004, he worked on the team of the EU Commissioner for Development and Humanitarian Aid, Paul Nielsen, first as press spokesperson, then as a member of his staff. Mr. Curtis has also had 2 stints working for the European Commission's Secretariat General, focusing on relations with the EU member states in the area of foreign policy and trade, then relations with the European External Action Service, where he was closely involved with its setting up in 2010. I cede the floor to you, Mr. Curtis. Welcome to Virginia Tech.
Thank you, Dean Belmonte, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Professor Stavakis for the invitation to deliver this year's John Monnet lecture and for bringing together the John Monnet Academic Network from across the US for this occasion. Yanis, your enthusiastic leadership as the Jean Monnet Chair at Virginia Tech, promoting excellence in research, teaching, and learning of European studies is appreciated and really makes a difference. To all of you participating from across the US, it's good to see you, even virtually. Thank you for joining today's call. I know it's a busy time for everyone coming up with the end of the term, so I'll dive right in. I've been asked to speak about EU foreign policy priorities and EU-US cooperation. When preparing this, it occurs to me that 15 years ago, speaking about EU foreign policy might have been considered a bit fanciful or premature, because the common foreign and security policy was still in its infancy. Although this CFSP, as we call it, was established by the 1993 Maastricht Treaty, it wasn't really until after the Lisbon Treaty of 2009 that the EU set up its own diplomatic service, notwithstanding our important role as a trade and development partner for most countries around the world. The European External Action Service, or the EAS, is the diplomatic arm of the European Union, much like the US State Department. And the EU delegation in Washington, D.C., where I have served as Deputy Ambassador since 2019, is an important part of the EAS network of 143 diplomatic missions worldwide operating under the leadership of High Representative Josep Borrell, who is, by the way, Secretary Blinken's counterpart. And since September 2022, we also have an office in San Francisco focused on digital and tech issues. On EU foreign policy, as I've just explained, in a few short years, the EU has become a major foreign policy actor. Why is this? I'll start with three reasons. Because of our trade and economic weight globally, the EU single market, now 30 years old, is the world's biggest and most open market operating under uniform rules. It is 450 million citizens and consumers. This market is backed by our single currency, the euro, now over 20 years in circulation, and the currency of 20 EU member states. The euro is also the world's second reserve currency after the dollar. Because the EU and its member states are the biggest provider of overseas development assistance globally, I'll come back to this later. But the third reason, but most of all because of our geography. The EU is in a dangerous neighborhood in close proximity to a number of conflicts which threaten European security. These include the war in Syria, which began in 2011 after Assad crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrations, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which began in 2014 before the full-scale aggression in 2022, and most recently, a new war in the Middle East following the October 7th Hamas attacks in Israel. I could mention several other concerning developments or setbacks, like the now stalled efforts to reach a nuclear agreement with Iran, the rise of autocratic governments that threaten the international order, and an increasingly assertive China. For all these reasons, the European Union has become more closely integrated in matters of security and defense. While the trend was gradually going in this direction over time, the pace accelerated dramatically following Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In fact, security and defense have replaced economy and climate as the top concerns on Europeans' minds in the most recent Eurobarometer poll. Fortunately, EU leaders have steadily been building capacity on security and defense matters for the better part of a decade now. EU member states can now cooperate on defense under a program of permanent structured cooperation called PESCO. The European Commission set up a European Defence Fund to finance collaborative research, and a new European Peace Facility was established in 2021 to fund EU actions with military and defence implications. This facility has been used to support the provision of weapons by our member states to Ukraine. This is the first time we have done this. In February of this year, Commission President von der Leyen announced a groundbreaking proposal for a joint European defence industry procurement strategy. Its purpose is to help the EU achieve defence industrial readiness, reduce redundancy, and boost the interoperability of systems used by different member countries' armed forces. With war on our doorstep, these issues are no longer taboo for the EU. Not that we are about to build a military alliance or have a European army, but we need to build self-reliance. Of course, we will do so in a manner that is complementary to NATO, to which 23 of our 27 member states belong, with Sweden and Finland joining very recently. I should also mention that the EU can and does undertake joint actions and plays a leading role in international peacekeeping operations and conflict prevention. Around 5,000 military and civilian staff are deployed in operations on 3 continents. There are currently 12 civilian missions and 9 military missions ongoing in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. One of these missions is training some 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers. I would like now to focus on the EU's current foreign policy priorities in relation to the United States, Ukraine, China, and the latest developments in the Middle East. Ukraine has been a major focus of our diplomatic work since February 2022. The level of contact and engagement between the EU and the US on this issue is just simply unprecedented. Ukraine is fighting for survival against a regime that wants to wipe it off the map and reverse the course of history. Allowing this to happen would be a colossal strategic error for European security, the United States, and our allies, and one we will pay for dearly. So far, the EU and US have been able to support Ukraine in this struggle to hold off a much bigger army with considerable economic, financial, humanitarian, and military support, and without any of our own boots on the ground. Our support is critical. Without it, Ukraine will lose and Russia will win. And a Russian victory would be disastrous, especially for the Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Also for people elsewhere, because there is no safe distance from an emboldened autocrat sitting on nuclear weapons. We welcome Saturday's vote in the US House of Representatives to unblock the urgently needed supplemental aid to Ukraine promised by President Biden. Europe is doing its part. Since the start of the war, the EU and its member states have made available over $150 billion in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance through 2027. We have imposed 13 rounds of massive sanctions on Russian entities and individuals and decoupled almost completely from Russian fossil fuel. This has not been easy for Europeans, but for the majority of Europeans, there is no doubt that helping Ukraine is the best way to help ourselves against a ruthless foe. We are confident that Ukraine can prevail and secure its place in a free and democratic Europe. Last December, in another unprecedented move, the EU made history by making Ukraine, a country at war, a candidate for EU membership, along with Georgia and Moldova. We look forward to negotiations with Ukraine and know that this step is hugely important as Ukraine and its people plan for life after war. EU enlargement is back on the agenda. Ukraine is one of 10 countries that has applied to join the EU and currently has candidate status. This shows the EU's continuing power of attraction. And it is in the EU's interest, as membership in the EU has, without precedent, strengthened individual member states and increased prosperity. The new war in the Middle East cannot allow us to lose focus on Ukraine. This is not an either-or situation. We have to manage both. On the Middle East, the EU's position is clear. We have condemned the October 7th Hamas attacks, the horrific attacks that took the life of over 1,200 Israelis and triggered this conflict. We have called for the release of all hostages, and we fully support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international and humanitarian law. At the same time, we find the civilian death toll in Gaza, 34,000, disproportionate and unacceptable. The EU is working with partners, including the US, to operate a maritime corridor to deliver desperately needed humanitarian assistance to Gaza, but wider humanitarian aid access is needed, and we have been pressing Israel to open up this access. We are pushing for an immediate ceasefire and working with partners to avoid a wider conflict. The situation is extremely dangerous in the wider region following the direct hostilities between Iran and Israel. We have been calling for de-escalation and urging all parties to show restraint. Our position is that the best way to advance an enduring peace and Israel's security is to support the creation of an independent Palestinian state side by side with Israel. We must give hope to the Palestinians by helping to reopen a political process to Palestinian statehood. Where there is no hope, there is despair, anger, and resentment. The EU is also taking action to stop attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. We recently launched a new defensive maritime operation called Aspides, Greek for shields, and are in close coordination with the US to ensure greater complementarity with its Prosperity Guardian maritime operation. Here in DC, it is hard to have a meeting, or in fact anywhere else in the US, without someone mentioning China. This happened just last week when 9 EU ambassadors were in Alaska for a symposium on climate change consequences for the Arctic. It didn't take long for local leaders to air concerns that China's move to brand itself as a near Arctic nation could spell trouble. Both the EU and the US have complicated relationships with China, whose failure to unequivocally condemn Putin's aggression in Russia created unease in Europe and the US. China's lack of respect for human rights, treatment of minorities, growing assertiveness in the South China Sea, and the difficulties our companies face doing business there have given us serious pause. China is an important trade and economic partner for the EU and the US. For the EU, China in the area of trade represents 9% of our good exports and 20% of our imports. China is also an important partner when it comes to fighting climate change. So it is neither viable nor in the EU's interest to completely couple from China. So we have decided to de-risk. This means engaging with Beijing to ensure that we understand each other better, including in areas where we have disagreements, but being ready to deploy our toolkit against unfair trade practices where and when needed. Of course, working together, the EU and US have more leverage. We have a strategic dialogue on China for a number of years now, in which we exchange information about our respective leader-level engagements with China and discuss scope for more aligned actions on China in the future. Over time, this has become a trusted format for sharing assessments on topics such as the human rights situation in China and how to best respond to China's behavior regionally. By doing this, we are protecting EU-US economic security and improving our resilience by reducing critical dependencies and vulnerabilities. We tend not to think of foreign policy when we think of the United States because of the close ties that have existed since the dawn of European integration. But the truth is, we are each other's most important foreign and economic and security partners. This is not new. The US has supported European integration since the beginning and regarded a strong Europe as good for the United States. Yes, there have been tensions, but that is because we are close as partners and close as competitors. Currently, EU-US relations are at a high point thanks to the leadership of the Biden and von der Leyen administrations, who have made a conscious effort to move on from squabbles over tariffs and aircraft subsidies to mapping out how we could best put our historic decade-old ties to work to tackle the biggest global challenges of this day. And I think we've managed to do a lot in this respect. On the trade side, we parked simmering disputes and focused instead on preparing our economies to compete in the digital age through a dedicated vehicle called the Trade and Technology Council. But there's still much work to do, and we hope the work done since 2021 carries over to the next administration. The truth is, we cannot afford to sacrifice valuable bandwidth when a stable trade and investment relationship is so patently in our interest, not just economic, but also strategic, and vital to our future competitiveness. Our economic relationship remains a major prosperity driver, supporting 10 million jobs directly and 16 million indirectly on both sides of the Atlantic. In almost every US state, we are the first or second trade and investment partner. We exchange over $1.3 trillion a year in goods and services annually, which is around 3.6 billion a day. And EU investment in the US is 10 times what we invest in China and India together. So the EU and the US are both in the process of green transitions at home. We are also working bilaterally and in the multilateral framework to keep the Paris Treaty target of 1.5 Celsius for global warming within reach. This is very important because each month since last June, the Earth has experienced the highest temperatures ever on record. The consequences are being felt in our Arctic and low-lying nations with cascading devastating effects. So together we are pushing for a 30% reduction in global methane emissions because it is the most potent greenhouse gas. So far, we have signed up 155 countries to the Global Methane Pledge, which we spearheaded. The EU is the first major economy to enshrine over our 2050 net zero climate goal in law, and we are the biggest provider of climate finance for developing countries. Before I turn over to you, I would like to talk also a little bit about democracy, which has been a strand of EU-US cooperation over the years. This year, more voters than ever in history will go to the polls in 64 countries, including in the EU and in the US. In early June, European elections will directly elect a new European Parliament, and a new European Commission will take office in November for a 5-year term. At the same time, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention that we are following the US campaigns and primaries very closely, and will be prepared to work with the next US administration, whichever candidate wins, and whichever candidate the American people decide. Change is coming, and that is normal in real democracies. What keeps us moving steadily forward is not just our shared interests, but our shared values. In many parts of the world, these values are under pressure as multiple crises, from the pandemic to conflict, global change and climate change, have eroded confidence and reversed progress in some areas. This may explain why some countries in the developing world did not align with us in condemning Putin's war in Ukraine, notwithstanding his weaponization of grain and energy shipments that had direct and adverse effects for them. The fact is that the EU and the US have been the most generous donors of development assistance for decades. And as I mentioned earlier, the EU and its member states are in fact the world's largest donor by far, accounting for 43% of all official development assistance. Through the EU's €300 billion Global Gateway initiative, we are supporting green infrastructure development in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and the Asia and Pacific. The Global Gateway is the EU contribution to the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, in which the EU and the US cooperate. Some examples of the EU-US cooperation under the Global Gateway include the Lobito Corridor infrastructure project, connecting the port of Lobito in Angola with the Katanga province in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Copper Belt in Zambia. This project, announced at the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment at the G20 in India last year, is a concrete example of how we can join forces to unlock the enormous potential of a vast region on the continent of Africa to create value chains and jobs locally while decreasing the carbon footprint and improving local economies. One thing to be understood about the EU is that change is a constant, and it drives us forward, even following major setbacks. Over the past 2 decades, the EU has had its share of challenges, but we learn by doing, and with every challenge we dig deep, become more agile, more determined, and more united. This is how we could be so decisive in dealing with the most serious crisis in Europe since our founding, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We have not been found wanting in either courage or commitment. If anything, we have gained recognition and respect across the US for getting things done at warp speed, like adopting these sanctions on Russia and for aiding Ukraine and its people. It is difficult to overstate the importance of education and universities for our democracies, our societies, and our capacity to innovate and to prepare leaders for high responsibility. From my experience in diplomacy, I can attest that a big part of international relations comes down to strong people-to-people contacts. At last October's EU-US summit at the White House, Presidents Biden and von der Leyen committed to strengthening EU-US relations, including through people-to-people exchanges. Officials on both sides of the Atlantic are working together to boost the number of academic exchanges under the Erasmus Plus and Fulbright Schumann programs, and by providing funding for Fulbright commissions in EU member states. All this will significantly increase the number of European-American exchanges between our citizens over the next 5 years. And allow me to end on a personal note. Even though current times are challenging, I have never felt more confident that the EU has what it takes to be a force of good in the world. And it is also because I believe the EU-US relationship can go from strength to strength as long as we choose leaders who value it and understand its potential. With that, I would like to thank you again for listening to my lecture today, and I now turn the floor over to you for questions. Thank you.